Hello and welcome to this presentation on legal control in a time of COVID. My name is Amy Rushen and I'm the Head of Law and Criminology at Newman University. It's very odd at the moment because I feel I have to put a timestamp on this recording. So today is the 9th of November 2020. And the reason I'm opening with a timestamp is because this recording's been planned for sort of 10 days, 2 weeks. And each day I've sat down to do it, I've realised that there's been a further change. Ironically, the first plans to record were in fact in the day that the second lockdown was announced in England. So it's a very strange time in respect of the way the law has changed. Those of you that have seen my previous recording talked about the ethics of lockdown. But today I'm going to look at the specific legal requirements we find ourselves under. For those of you that aren't familiar with the legislation that governs the COVID response, and I'm focusing particularly on England today, I will make various references to other parts of the country, but the arrangements in England are the particular focus. What we have is the Coronavirus Act 2020, and you'll have seen discussion of that in my colleagues' NCHEM's recording earlier in the year. And what the Coronavirus Act 2020 allows for is regulations, statutory instruments that give a rapid response to the changing restrictions of COVID. So where things change, lockdowns brought in by way of regulations, there were regulations brought in governing the use of face coverings in public transport and so on. And effectively, these are pieces of secondary legislation that do not pass through the usual parliamentary process. So what we have is our Enabling Act, our Coronavirus Act 2020, that then allows for statutory instruments to be passed to change the way we respond from day to day. So what we have now is the latest round of coronavirus legislations, and those of you that have been keeping up with the news recently, in particular the political aspect of lockdown, which to be fair is pretty hard to avoid, will appreciate that actually we've had a growing discussion in the House of Commons about the fact that these regulations need to be debated, they need to be discussed. And in fact, when the most recent lockdown was announced on the Saturday, it was then formally announced in the Commons on Monday, and the latest regulations were debated last Wednesday. Hence the slight delay in this recording, because there was, of course, the potential for the regulations to be amended prior to them coming into force last Thursday. But they remain largely the same, and what we have now is a much stricter regime of legal control. But also we have some really interesting developments in the way that these new regulations have been scrutinised, but also the penalties in response to breach of the regulations. So what you'll find is if you look across the different regions of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland and how they've responded, we actually now have quite a different system of legal penalties depending on which country you're sitting in. So, for example, anybody over the age of 18 in England for a breach of the COVID regulations will be fined £200 for the first offence, lowered to only £100 if it's paid within 14 days. So think of it as a very, very heavy parking fine. Anybody who's ever had a parking fine knows that you get a discount if you pay within the first 14 days. That's basically how they're penalising breaches of the regulations. You breach lockdown, you're looking at £200 fine for a first offence. Now, interestingly, if you contrast that with the legal penalties and therefore the legal control put in place in other parts of the UK, the fines are significantly lower. So England has £200, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland start at 60. So what we now have as a result of the way the regulations have been implemented and the way the devolved regulations have gone forward is we now have two differing systems of legal control. So not just the restrictions that you're under, which we all know differ significantly according to which area of the country you're in, but also the penalty for breach. When you look at how the repeated fine regime works, you'll find that the legal penalties actually then diverge much more significantly. So, for example, in England, the latest regulations have said that people can be fined for repeated breaches up to £6,400. Contrast that with Scotland and Northern Ireland, which, as at today, the fine for repeated breaches is a maximum of £960. And in Wales, they don't have any repetitive offence accumulation. It's simply £120 for the second offence and each offence afterwards. Now, while that may well be justifiable in the context of different countries' infection levels, different countries' restrictions and so on, it raises a very interesting legal question in terms of what underpins our system of law in the UK, and that being specifically the underpinning rule of law. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the rule of law, it's a legal theory that talks about why law exists and what law should be. And one of the key components of the rule of law is around consistency, that the law should be consistent, there should not be wide discretion, and there should not be unfair, arbitrary use of power. Surely the difference between the penalty from 1 metre on the English border to 1 metre across on the Welsh border, surely that's an arbitrary use of power. Does that correspond with what we understand the law to be? That actually something that is considered so significant in England to attract a potential fine of over £6,000, or I believe it's £10,000 for businesses, is penalised much more lightly if you move that metre across the border into Wales. Surely that creates arbitrary application of the law. Now, more importantly, behind that is the human rights aspect of this. Now, believe me when I say I'm not using human rights to undermine any of the regulations or to espouse breaches of the regulations in any way, shape or form. In fact, from a personal ethical viewpoint, I entirely support the steps that are being taken. But it does make me consider how that can be justified. We have legislation, secondary legislation, that has not gone through the appropriate statutory steps that an enabling act would do, that it has taken a number of months for demands that these regulations be debated to actually take place, which was last week. And we have this issue around fundamental infringements in our private and family life. We have the restriction of liberty. Now, interestingly, when you look at the Human Rights Act itself and you look at the right to liberty, so that's Article 5 in the Human Rights Act 1998, which includes the European Convention on Human Rights, and you look at Article 5, which talks about the right to liberty, there is provision with that for someone's liberty to be infringed to prevent the prevention of spreading infectious diseases. You look at Article 8, which is the right to public and family life, and that refers to infringements on that right in the interests of public health. So while the human rights aspect is clearly satisfied by the need to protect society as a whole, it still leaves that element of discomfort around the underpinning arbitrary use of power. Now, is it justified? I've said already, in my view, it is, but there is still that little element of discomfort in the way things have progressed and the way things have changed. It's likely that things will change again. I put a timestamp at the beginning of this short presentation. It may be that what I'm saying today is overtaken by events when we come out of lockdown in the 2nd of December. It may be that these infringements, clearly justified in the interests of public health, will pass away, particularly given the information we're now getting in the media around a potential vaccine. But underpinning all of this is the need for any change to accord with the rule of law. Thank you very much.